This is the second week of the message series called Our Ability to Respond. Last week, as we began this series, we were reminded that frequently our ability to respond is based fairly strictly or strongly on where we start. And we listened to the passage from the book of Maccabees, where we had the 7 sons who were being tortured and put to death because they refused to taste pig's flesh. Each of them made a statement that spoke about how their faith was important to them. And the 4th of the sons made a comment that was the last part of last Sunday's reading, which told us why he believed that what they were experiencing or what they were going to experience was something really important or really special. He said, "Ours is the better choice, to meet death at men's hands, yet relying on God's promise that we shall be raised up by him. Whereas for you, there can be no resurrection, no new life." So their belief in the resurrection from the dead meant that what happened to them in this life was inconsequential, because it was not the end, but rather the beginning. And then the gospel passage told us the story of the Sadducees who came asking a question about whether who was going to be married to the widow at the resurrection. Now, it was part of the Mosaic law, but it was in fact just a distraction. We know that their intent was to try to trap Jesus by making him respond in a way that they could claim then that he had spoken out against the law of Moses. But in fact, Jesus' response was the complete opposite of what they expected, because instead of trying to argue the point, he actually quoted from the book of Exodus. Now, that's a significant statement because the Sadducees only held as being sacred the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which they called the Torah. And they held them to be important. So quoting from one of the books of their law meant that the wind was taken out of their sails. So Jesus quotes from chapter 2 of the book of Exodus, where he says, the God told Moses, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." But then he goes on to tell them, now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are in fact alive. The ability of the young men who were being put to death, the ability of this was because of their faith. The ability of the Sadducees to respond was in fact restricted, not freely given as the young men, but it was restricted because of their sticking to the legalism of what the Mosaic law said. So rather than seeing the spirit of what Moses was talking about, they failed to recognize the deeper reality that Jesus was now presenting to them. Reality that said it's not just obedience to the law which will win you favor in God's sight, but rather the capacity to have a relationship with God. And a relationship with God can't be restricted by laws. In 2018, the bishops of Australia, as they spoke about the preparation for the plenary that was held in the last 2 years, set before the people of Australia a question. The question is, what is God asking of us in Australia at this present time? They were hoping to invite us to look not just at what our past had been, but rather what we might do into the future. It was a similar kind of response that Pope John XXIII was asking of the world church back in 1959, when he called together what we now know to be the Second Vatican Council, as he invited the bishops of the world to think about what do we want the church to look like into the future. One commentary suggested the council laid down the premise of the new walk of the church in contemporary society. Even being the same as yesterday, the church lives and realizes in Christ its today, which took flight especially post-Vatican II. It was preparing the church for the passage from the second millennium to the third after the birth of Christ. Today, in our gospel passage, we see something of the question that sits in the middle of all that thought. We see an event which can remind us that it's quite easy to be focused on what's the past rather than what is to be coming into the future. Listen again to the opening words of the passage. When some were talking about the temple, remarking how it was adorned with fine stonework and votive offerings, Jesus said, "All these things you're staring at now, the time will come when not a single stone will be left on another. Everything will be destroyed." Jesus was prophesying about the future destruction of the temple, which happened in the year 70. But he was also speaking about his own death and what that would mean to the people. And so often happens, as it does today, the statement is lost in the mindset of those who are listening. So rather than thinking about what he was saying, their first question is, when will this happen and what signs will there be? Again, we need to listen to the response that Jesus makes to their question, because it reminds us that the gospel was written after the temple had been destroyed, so those who were listening would actually have known what was happening. So what signs will they see? Jesus gives a whole list of things. But it comes back to the question that we asked at the beginning. What is our ability to respond to what's going on around us? And so we can come back to the question the bishops asked in 2018. What is God asking of me at this time? If I personally were just to look around and see that there seems to be a few less people in the pews each week, then I'm looking at the fabric, and I'm not really looking deeper into the questions that might confront us. The fact that there may not be people here doesn't mean to say people don't believe. It's just they're now expressing their faith in a very different way to what we are used to. So how do we begin to approach them? Before we explore what that might look like, let's go back to the response Jesus made. Towards the end of the passage, he makes two comments. One is, "Take care not to be deceived, because many will come using my name and saying, 'I am he,' and the time is near." Now we know that about the time of Jesus, about the time that Luke's gospel was written, there had been a number of people who had in fact come and said, "I'm Christ returned," and they had attracted a whole lot of attention. And so it was a case, a work in hand, to ensure that people weren't distracted by those people. Jesus then goes on to say that parents and brothers will betray you, relations and friends, and some of you will even be put to death. Again, we know that that was a reality that many people had already experienced. But amidst the vision that Jesus is presenting to these people, he also makes two statements which remind us that in the midst of the disaster, he is always with us. He tells them, firstly, "Keep this carefully in mind. You are not to prepare your defense, because I myself shall give you the eloquence and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to contradict." And then he adds, and this is perhaps more appropriate for some people rather than others, "Not a hair of your head will be lost. Your endurance will win you your lives." As I said, that applies to some people more than others. But if we come back to the question, what are the signs that we can see as part of our present reality? I have to admit that there are gaps in what we might do in the area of faith formation in our community, especially when we talk about the formation of parents as they walk with their children in preparation for the sacraments. That has a profound implication, because so often our sacraments are celebrated and we rarely see the children afterwards. It's not the case always, and we are lucky in this parish that there are quite a number of families where that's not the case. But there is a great gap between the number of children baptised, the number of children who then receive the other sacraments, and the number of children who are then in the church with their families later on. We strive to give the children an experience of evangelization as they prepare for the sacraments. But I believe that there is an area where we need to do so much more. And I believe that one of those areas in particular has to do with preparation for baptism. At the moment, it's basically me talking to the parents as they come asking to have their child baptised. It's a conversation that goes between half an hour and 3/4 of an hour. But in the end, it's a conversation. It's not really a kind of experience, or at least it doesn't appear to be an experience that invites the family to go further. So where do we go with that? I had hoped that it would have been part of the conversation that was part of the event that was to be held last Sunday, but which sadly had to be postponed because of the weather. But it's a reminder to us that if we're going to be a people who are responding to the church and the needs of the church, then we have to start at a place where people touch the church. And that's nearly always at baptism and in the celebration of the sacraments for their children. That's where we meet most of the people in where we can have a bit of a contact and a bit of impact. Now, I don't suggest that this is a situation that just applies in our parish. You can go to just about every parish in the world and they're facing the similar kind of question. But if we want our church in the future to look something differently, then it's our ability to respond today which is going to have an impact on what that looks like. And it's not just the priest, and it's not just any paid staff or school staff. It has to be all of us who accept this responsibility, or at least the challenge to do something different. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do, and I'm not going to tell you how to do it, because I personally don't know the answer completely to that question. But I do know that as a community, we need to look slightly differently. There's a passage that St. Augustine made famous quite some time ago. He said, we are to pray as if everything depends on God and work as if it all depends on us. So we have to look at the signs that are facing us. What do we do to speak about living the gospel message in a way that actually invites people to be part of the community? We can go and look at the church and say, isn't the building lovely? And we can wonder about the grandeur of a building. But the building's a building. The people, you, me, together are the church. And we are the ones who are the face of the church in the community. And so it's our responsibility, our role to live that. And the church of the future will be formed, not just by us, because we rely on Christ and we rely on the Spirit of God to walk with us and to be with us. So we pick up that passage that Jesus said, I will give you an eloquence and a wisdom that nobody will be able to contradict. But we still need to recognize that it's God's gift that we share. So we pray that God will be with us, but we work as if it depends on us to make known the kingdom in our day and in our time.